I want to say a couple of words, or maybe one, on the issue of racialization. Race, as we know it as a noun, is actually the result of prior actions. And one prior action is racialization. By racialization, I mean the decision made by people, by society, if you will, to ascribe value to visible human physical differences and to solidify those values in such a way that they are forever marking people in indelible ways. That's racialization. But there is another action, prior action to race as a noun. It is looking at race as a verb. And I like it very much. Those of you who, I saw many of them, who were in my ethnicity class last, was it spring? I think it's spring. I'm on sabbatical, I don't know. Spring, I posted this article that I can mention to all of you. It's worth reading. It's called The Invention of Asian Americans by Robert S. Chang, and who is a professor of law and emeritus director of the Fred T. Korematsu Center of Law and Equality at Seattle University School of Law. It's a 2013 article, and I want to read just one section to you, just one paragraph. It's using race as a verb. This is page 950 in this particular publication. Race continues to confound us. We are told that race does not have a biological or genetic basis. I just covered a lot of territory by just mentioning this. Yet we find that biomedical researchers following federal guidelines use racial categories in their studies in ways that make race appear biological or genetic. It has become standard in legal and sociological literature to refer to race as a social contract, yet the biomedical researchers, we seem unable to free ourselves from the biological substrata that lies underneath our current theoretical conception of race. Now, the idea here is that, and talking about Du Bois and other people, that the best way to think of race is to think of it as a verb. So the section is, race is what race does. This is the conclusion. Understanding that race is what race does is vital to understanding the construction of the Asian racial category within the United States. He talks about raced persons. To sum it up, he says, scientific racialism relied on biology to justify the discriminatory treatment of blacks in the social and legal order. It, quote, unquote, raced persons of African ancestry to produce a subordinated racial group, blacks. While scientific racialism was discredited, what might be termed sociological racialism emerged not to justify the discriminatory treatment of blacks, but to account for differences in outcomes as resulting from cultural differences. So the idea of two things. Race is a product of racialization. It is a product of racing people. That's the first thing I want to say to begin with. Zach, you are here. The thesis that I want to work with is race is not very present in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. Yet race has been constructed from biblical and theological factors. The first thing that you see here is the so-called TO map. It's for those of you who were in the ethnicity classes, just review. This is the first known printed map, actually, at least in European history. It's a three-sun, three-continent view. By three-sun, three-continent view, we mean Genesis 9, right? The sons of Noah. Come on, you are at TED's. As soon as I say three sons, you should say Shem. Good, you're doing very well. All right. Three sun, three continent view. The map is strange because the Orient is up. It's not, it's an old map. So Shem for Asia, right? Come on now. You can see it. Ham or Kam for Africa, and Japhet for Europe. That has more enduring legacy in terms of racialization than we think. So my point is that racialization should be put at the feet of Christians. Racialization is in part a product of Bible and theology as they have been worked out by Christians. I think that's important to note. You see, if you look for how we use race today, to see that in the Bible, you will not necessarily find it. That you can sit down and you can leave this. When I need you, I will tell you, I guess. I looked in vain for the word race as we understand it today in the Bible. There are a couple of places where it could have appeared, but I want to mention only two of them. The first one is Ezra 9:3. The context is one of mixed marriages, and I only looked at three versions of the Bible in English, just to help ourselves. I look at the ESV, English Standard Version. I look at the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and I look at the NIV. And that particular verse is translated in the ESV so that the holy race has mixed itself with the surrounding peoples. By the Holman Christian Standard Bible of 1999 and following, the holy seed, in quotation mark, has become mixed. And the NIV, the holy race. The better translation in this case is the Holman, because it pays attention to the fact that if we use race today, especially in the context of mixed marriages, we cannot help it but live the reality of a raced society, a racialized society where we have the three-sun, three-continent view in our mind, whether we like it or not. So, holy seed is a better translation. My contention is, how is it that, especially the ESV, noting particularly in the footnote that the Hebrew is offspring for the word, chose to keep the word race in 2015. Racialization continues unwittingly through our Bible translators. Act 17:28. The ESV has offspring. It's quoting a poet there. We are of his offspring, says the ESV. The Holman Christian Standard Bible says also, offspring. The NIV says offspring. So they all agree it's offspring. Now you are at TEDS. The word in the Greek is genos. Here, it could have been translated race more properly, because it would make the point. We are of God's race. We are of God's genos. And in the French, that's exactly how it's translated. Nous sommes de sa race. Well, for other languages, you can check. The point is, from biblical understanding, there's only one race. That's what we call, we are made in God's image. We are of God's genos, all of us. And therefore, a proper usage of race is right there, but not in the way it's been used in the other translation. So that's the one thing I want to do. And I want to go very, very quickly with a couple of things. Zach's prevailed on me to bring books, and I may not fit the 15 minutes time frame. Daniel Hartman, if I speak too long, you will know why I'm speaking too long. He brought books, and you can take a look at them. But I want to, for those of you who don't have much time, and TED students don't have much time, because there are too many things to read, all of these books are must reading. This one is particularly good. It's a very short one. It's called Racism, A Short History by George Fredrickson. It's actually a very, very good book. George Fredrickson is professor of U.S. history at Stanford University, not the least of the universities of this country. You don't know me yet. It's a 2002 book. It's a short history, 2002, published by Princeton University Press. Again, not the least of the university presses in this country. In the introduction, there is a particular section that is worth your while, that I'm summarizing in 3 points, and then the first chapter is the chapter where that makes my thesis, and it's entitled "Religion and the Invention of Racism." Religion and the Invention of Racism. But before he gets there, he makes 3 points about the particular location where we are, called the West. First, he says, even if racism had existed elsewhere in rudimentary form, the virus of racism did not infect Europe itself prior to the period between the late medieval and early modern periods. So one thing that you all should know by being at TEDS is that racism in its viral form is quite late in human history and takes place in the so-called West, late medieval to early modern. Secondly, the varieties of racism that developed in the West had greater impact on world history than any functional equivalent that we might detect in another era or part of the world. I think that's important. For those of you who want to check, it's on page 11 when you want to read it. For all of us here, and I'm looking at the significant variety of humankind in front of me, why do we want to talk about race and racism in the West? Because of what Mr. Fredrickson says. What happened in the West has had significant impact on all of us, whether we like it or not. That's important. And thirdly, the logic of racism was fully worked out elaborately implemented and carried to its ultimate expressions in the West, while at the same time being identified, condemned, and resisted from the same cultural tradition. In other words, the virus of racism in the West developed at the same time while there was an idea of equality between all humans. End of tantalizing tidbits. It's worth your reading. Now, one particular place where we see that very clearly is in Spain. Especially from 1490s onward and culminating in the 16th century, where laws were enacted, and I'll say it in Spanish, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. I do have an article on that in Spanish if you want to read it. But these ideas of purity of blood enacted and modified only in Spain in the 19th and early 20th century. What does it actually mean? In the idea of the purity of blood, converso was the word, converted Jews and converted Moors, Muslim Moriscos, could not actually be fully Christians because of their ancestry. They were excluded ipso facto because of ancestry. And a converso from Judaism was still considered a Jew based on residence and occupation, particularly residence, the ghetto, where other Jews live, occupations such as merchants, doctors, tailors. The only difference between then and now is that Jews are no longer tailors, but they're certainly merchants and doctors. I had to put that in. But the church, particularly from the publication of Sentencia Estatuto by Pedro Sarmiento, which was a very anti-Semitic book, and was the church, the Catholic Church, was part of doing what it did. I'll finish and I'll get to the questions in front of you. Because I want to say that the limpieza de sangre, the purity of blood, was not just Catholic. It was also Protestant, particularly in New England. And here, there's a 2010 book written by Jean O'Brien, Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, 2010 book. Jean O'Brien, now I'll tell you who she is. She's an Earth-White Ojibwe, professor of history at the University of Minnesota. You will never have known it by just looking at the name Jean O'Brien. But Jean O'Brien, the impact she has here, at least for me, is that the purity of blood was also invoked by the English in New England, even though there was the so-called Anglo-Saxon kind of thing. Anglo-Saxon is already a couple of races anyway. I want to read one quotation that she has for you, and then I'll stop, and then my time is gone. There's a section about a Baptist church in the Welsh Baptist Church in Rhode Island, 1845. So let me read this. In 1845, an oration delivered during the dedication of the new Baptist Church contained a fascinating account of Welsh Baptists, beginning with the premise, quote, "The Welsh race from which the ancestors of this church sprang are the only pure descendants of the ancient Britons." If you are Welsh, you are pure. They were a wild Aboriginal race, probably the descendants of Gomer. That's why I'm reading it. Back to the TO map. Descendant of Gomer, the eldest son of Japhet, who was the youngest son of Noah. How did they find that out? I have no idea. The orator then proceeds to say, "Wave after wave of foreign populations poured upon the native race, and became intermixed with the British stock. The most numerous and successful of these invading hordes were the Angles, a valiant race, of Germanic origin from the valleys of the Elbe, etc., etc. So then he says, the conquered remnants of the ancient British were crowded step by step by each successive wave of foreign immigration that swept over the continent. And then eventually they disappeared and put themselves in Wales, and this became unmixed and homogeneous people, leaving behind them the Anglo-Saxon conquerors of their former territory, but small portion of their blood, and but few distinct traces of their national character. Purity of blood. The English in New England used the same thing to exclude others, particularly the Indians and the African Americans. And so, at the end of the 19th century, a person who was making a comment about the fact that there were wave after wave of immigrants from Europe, this is 1878 now, says, "For Saxon or Dane or Normans we, Teuton or Celt, whatever we be." So this new reality in New England was composed, new reality, population-wise, was composed of Saxon, Dane, Normans, Teuton, and Celt. And Gene O'Brien concludes, conspicuously absent are the Indians and Africans, or African Americans. The point is that racialization has consequences. We read them, those consequences, all over for us.